All right. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Got me nervous that time. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
I'm gonna go get some coffee.
Absolutely.
Can you say something for me, just so we can check if we have
Oh,
audio too?
oh yeah. What should I be saying? Today is about Jonah. Okay.
That's good.
Audio is coming through.
Well,
It's about whales, actually, right?
Yeah, that's right.
we have 30 seconds delay, so we'll see.
Okay. Oh, good morning. Morning.
Oh my, we are.
Sparse.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Oh, I have that one at home.
Yeah, let me see. This is the one I think maybe.
This is an Amos on top.
Okay. This one is the one that you want probably
Oh, okay.
because this one has Jonah.
Okay. Are we gonna use that one?
Yeah, we're using Jonah today.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. As you probably heard this morning, the gospel text from John and the wedding at Cana. It's my favorite miracle story with all that wine. No one wants to confess about it, but let's be very clear. What often strikes me about that first miracle of Jesus at a wedding is the fact that, by the way, he's invited to the wedding with his mother. Oops, I can get that. Oh, is this not too? It's locked. Oh.
Sorry.
No. Well, not sure how that. I guess we'll keep it open. There we go.
Whoa, not yet.
That Jesus attends the wedding at Cana with his mother, who presumably brought him along. And when the wine runs out, if you listen to the text, it sounds almost a little harsh, doesn't it? Woman, leave me alone, kind of thing. But actually, remember, that's really the same language that Jesus uses at the end of his life when he is on the cross. What does he say? Woman, behold your son. Remember? It's like a universal thing. But what often strikes me, and in addition to the miracle, is the idea of how many jars there were for purification rites. Okay? There were how many? I just want, we're going to do a little bit of math here. There were 6 jars, and each jar holds 30 gallons. And Jesus turned water into wine. And I'm thinking, that has got to be some kind of celebration after that. 180 gallons of good wine. Welcome. And by the way, not just any wine, as the text says. This is the good stuff. Okay, this is the good stuff. It's the start of his ministry, and so, scholars would say his ministry lasted for 3 years, so probably about 30. One has to be careful because we don't know precisely.
I just wondered, since this was at the beginning and he said to his mother, I'm not ready.
I'm not ready. Yeah. No, I think, and by the way, we don't want any teenagers turning water into wine anyway. I mean, we have to have some kind of. Yeah. So, I want to talk a little bit about, interestingly, Vicar Asher this morning mentioned in passing Jonah. And of course, that's where we begin for the next couple of Sundays or so, talking a little bit about Jonah. And I want to place Jonah in some kind of context. Now, Jonah, sort of like maybe a few other characters in the Bible, often gets reduced to one thing that we remember, and that is Jonah and the fish, right? It doesn't say whale. Okay, we have somehow come up with the idea that it has to be a whale because I guess it would be difficult to be swallowed by a shark and come out, with all the teeth. So whale it is. Okay, in the same way that we have determined that in Genesis, Eve ate of the apple, except for one slight issue. There is no apple. Okay, and I don't care what Steve Jobs and Macintosh decided, there still was no apple. By the way, which is where he got the idea from, if you notice the logo, right? It's the bite out of the apple that gives you knowledge. Okay? Yeah. I'm glad I can help with pop culture. So we remember that, and sometimes we remember about other characters, Moses in the wilderness, and so on. Okay, but there is more to the story, and I want to somehow place it in some kind of context. We don't know with absolute certainty when this particular story was told. We don't know. Okay, I think most scholars have agreed that it's a later story. That is to say, after the exile, or what we might say, it's a post-exilic story. Okay, and whether or not it happens, that's a whole different story, right? Remember now, for something to be true doesn't mean that it has to have occurred. Jesus told a lot of parables, remember, that has truth in them, but, they're stories to make a point. So where do we place Jonah in some kind of context? Oh, every time I see someone leave the room, I think it's something I said. Turns out. So let me briefly orient us to this. After the people came out of exile, and we talked about Jeremiah last week, generally, the majority of scholars, anyone who takes it seriously anyway, have concluded that the exile ended around 538 before the time of Christ, okay, before the Christian era. And after that, one of the first things that the people set out to do was to rebuild the temple, what became known as the Second Temple. So if you were to visit Jerusalem, or certainly if you've seen, on video or whatever the case might be, the Temple Mount and around it, you will see the remains. There are some remains there. Okay, so some of that is still there. Literally, blocks of stone are still there. That's the Second Temple. The first, of course, as you know, was built by Solomon, right? And that, of course, we don't have any idea. Based on what we think it might have looked like, there are all kinds of constructions, right, in art to suggest what a Solomonic temple looked like. So after the people came out of exile, one of the things that happened, in addition to the temple, was two other sort of Old Testament characters by the name of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah were leaders. And Ezra and Nehemiah sought to sort of galvanize the people as they're coming back out of exile into the recreation of a community. One of the things that they said, okay, and let me pause here, because I know without me saying what I'm about to say, you will make the connections. But part of my role is to ensure that we do. You probably have concluded by now that I firmly believe that these prophetic texts and the prophets of ancient Israel, the Hebrew prophets, the message still has resonance for us. It does. You don't need me to make it relevant. I begin with the supposition that it is relevant. The question is, how do we make the connections? What does it mean for us? And I say that because even obscure, and I'm not putting you on the spot, but really, how many of us in here have been reading about Ezra and Nehemiah? If you are, you need to get out more often. Okay? We don't read about Ezra and Nehemiah any more than we sit down working through Leviticus. It doesn't mean it's unimportant and irrelevant. It just doesn't rise to the top of the things that is of interest. But Ezra and Nehemiah have a critical role to play in the post-exilic life of ancient Israel. And that is, they believe that as the people were coming back, because they had spent these years, this generation or more in Babylonian exile, and they were marrying and they were taking husbands and taking wives and so on, that in fact what you ended up happening was, if you will, intermarriages. And Ezra and Nehemiah said, if we are going to rebuild a community of Jews in ancient Israel, what do we need? No more intermarriages. We do not want you marrying foreigners or people who don't believe as we do. By the way, so when I said that 2,800 years later, this has resonance and relevance, right? Because Ezra and Nehemiah wanted to create what kind of a society? Pure society. And the language of creating a pure society hints at what? This is also the language that who else used? That would be about, 75, 80 years ago, right? Adolf Hitler, right? So we don't want people mixing. And, I will say, we've heard this language not that long ago in our own society, the language of purity and the language of what? Mixing of what? Of blood, right?
You said two different things, though. You said foreigners or people who think like us. Those are two very or are they together?
Yeah. So Ezra and Nehemiah believe that if you're going to recreate the society, sort of, right? You have the Second Temple. You want sort of the Jews to sort of galvanize into one again, right? They felt it was important to keep the foreigners out.
So non-ethnic people, even if they did believe the way that they did, they would not be accepted.
Likely, okay? But also people who did not believe as they did, okay? Yes, right? And that was an issue. So we don't want intermarriages, but we don't...
Not welcoming.
No.
Definitely not. Okay,
not welcoming outsiders. Because outsiders would what? Taint. Okay. By the way, you know and I know that we don't have to go home and think deep thoughts about the problems that such a perspective would have. Okay, it's not only dangerous, but also full well if we say that one, we're all created in the image of God, that God creates creation, and that God, in fact, in the Tower of Babel episode, is intentionally told the people, you cannot separate yourself and build a tower only so that you yourself, we don't want to mix with others. It's one of the few places that God said, this kind of unity, by the way, is not a good thing. Scattering in that moment became a better thing. Mix. Be with the people. So in that context, right, we believe that the story of Jonah emerged. And the important part of this is that should God care about outsiders? Should the God in whom we believe care about folks who are not like us? Should the God in whom we believe, who, by the way, is a creator God, we could twist and turn ourselves into pretzels, but at the end of the day, we still believe, as in Genesis, God created the universe, the creator God. Should the creator God care about all of creation, or should we decide that we will put brackets around who should receive grace and who shouldn't, who deserves grace and who doesn't, for whom God should care or not care? Do we make that determination? Now, this would be a moot question if, in fact, as human beings, we don't have the human impulse to feel that way. And we do. We do. So that's the context a little bit in which. One other quick example. You remember Elijah, right? We remember Elijah. Okay, he's one of those prophets who does not have a name of a book in his honor, so to speak, but who we know played a critical part in the life of ancient Israel. And when God spoke on one occasion to Elijah, you remember? And God sent him to a widow. Remember that story? God sent him to Sidon, to the widow of Zarephath. And in that encounter, the widow, who had very little dough to make bread, would in fact use that to care for Elijah, to give him food. Now, a miracle took place after that. But the point is, God sent an insider to, quote, a foreigner who is in a destitute position, nonetheless, to grant him that which he needs for sustenance. It's a remarkable story. And we don't want to reduce it to, well, that's really cute and that's really nice. No, it's more than that. There is a place, as in the widow of Zarephath. The second thing I would say as we get into this text is this. There is a danger, of course, where we decide that God belongs to us, that we control God, that instead of we human beings being created in the image of God, what have we done? We have created God in our image. God looks like us. God thinks like us. God help us if you ask me. We have reversed the idea. Now, there are folks who may not want to sort of accept this, but look around. This is what we have done. We believe that God is not only the God of, our God, but we own God. God is one of us. We seek to domesticate God. We seek to domesticate God. And we have gone as far as creating images where God sort of looks like some of us. And how does that work in ancient Israel? Let me help you out. It doesn't. Who wanted to build the first temple? David. David said, I have built homes made of cedar. We are living in we're living in comfortable means. All is well. Now that we have settled, you know what? I think it would be really nice to build a house for God as well in Jerusalem. And Nathan the prophet, who he checked with, and Nathan the prophet said, I think that's a good idea. But being a good prophet, Nathan said what? Let me check with God. And God said to Nathan, are you tracking with me? That's a bad idea. And not only is that a bad idea, I want you to go tell the king that's a bad idea. By the way, good luck with that. All right? But Nathan tells David, no. And one of the reasons is that David felt, if I can build a temple and have God in Jerusalem, we're all living here, all is well, that's it. Now, the issue is not whether you should have a temple, because of course David's son Solomon built the temple. But the issue is, should we seek to domesticate God as one of our own? And the answer is, by the way, without equivocation, the answer is no. So we get to Jonah. Now I'm telling you all of this in part because Jonah is more than the whale. There is something about this story that has profound implications for us, that goes beyond whether a fish, threw him up on the shore. Which, by the way, is what it did. We clean it up, but that's what it is. Yeah, sorry, excuse me.
So David wasn't allowed to build a temple, but Solomon built a huge temple.
Yes,
Did he ask God and God said it was okay?
yes,
He said it was okay for Solomon?
it wasn't. David, in part because the belief that David wanted, now that I have built homes for everyone in Cedar, right? In a way, we better take care of the Lord so that the Lord has a place. Okay, so T.S. Eliot, and I think it comes out of his poem, The Four Quatrains. But T.S. Eliot, which, by the way, Martin Luther King Jr. Cited in his letter from Birmingham jail, T.S. Eliot, and I will paraphrase, famously said in his poem, the last of the great treason is to do the right thing for the wrong reason. Okay? Because sometimes we are forced, or we believe we're doing the right thing, but we end up doing the right thing, but we are propelled to do it, not because it's the right thing, but because what our motivation lies. And by the way, we see it in our country, right? We sometimes pass laws, not because we think, this is really a good idea, but because what? The population decides, you know what? You're going to have to do this. And so we sort of drag our feet and reluctantly do the right thing. In a way, I think what David wanted to do was the right thing. His motivation behind it was questionable. God cannot be domesticated. And it spells it out. God said, did I not wander freely with you in the wilderness? And now essentially you're going to put me in the temple and keep me there? No. Now, Solomon, who's a whole different story, okay, had what I would call a complicated reign. Because he does build this temple, but he does so with, enslaving his own people. Okay? And inviting all kinds of outsiders, not because he believed that I want to embrace the whole world, but, trade, economics, bring in your beliefs to the point where you no longer have a core of what you stand for. So Solomon had his own issues. So Jonah, and I will read this then, comes after this. And it says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, saying, go up at once to Nineveh. And I want for us not to lose track of some of the language, that great city, and cry out against him, for their wickedness has come up before me. By the way, geographically, where would we find Nineveh today? In Iraq, right? This is not just a theoretical, let me give you a fake name here. It would be in Iraq, which, by the way, 20 years ago, right, during the Iraq War, right, one of the concerns was the destruction of ancient artifacts, biblical stuff. Okay, now not us in this room, on a serious note, but others would think, who cares what happens in Iraq and destroy, right? But actually, again, there is historical stuff there that was destroyed. But Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish. Again, we don't know where Tarshish is. Again, most scholars, based on how they have reconstructed, think it's probably close to where Spain would be today. Okay, so this is not just taking a little jaunt in the park. Okay, and remember now, this is predicated on Jonah doing what? Running from the presence of the Lord. Now you put that, let's keep that in the back of our minds. You are running from the presence of the Lord. Okay, and you're going to Spain. That might tell us a great deal about Spain. Okay, but Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid his fare, went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. It's repeating it. He is not going on vacation here. Okay, he is going with one motivating factor. I want to get away from, and it presupposes that what? God belongs here, right? And if I run way over there, I will get away from the presence of the Lord. Okay, now, we know in this room, because we're enlightened, but we know that, of course, this is like philosophy 101 now, right? If you have a false premise, if you begin with a false premise, it doesn't really matter how many great arguments you have after that, your conclusion is going to be false. Okay? If you begin with a false premise, and even if you have all of the glorified arguments, your conclusion is going to be flawed because the foundation, so to speak, was flawed. So this idea that if I run far enough away, I can run from the Lord, right? That's the premise. You can imagine what the conclusion is. Maybe that's where we get you can run, but you can't hide, in this case, from God. So, and here we go. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Again, even though the word itself is not mentioned here, the fact that the Lord can bring about a storm. Remember Jesus also in the Gospels, right? Okay. The fact that God could bring about a storm tells us that this is a God who controls what? All of creation. All of creation. And so sometimes, as we saw in Hosea and in Micah, human actions are such that there are consequences for all of creation. So we can go ahead and think, does this have implications for us today? Absolutely. What do our actions mean for all of creation? And for the rest of the world, maybe for people who do not look like us, or believe as we do, or think as we do, or live as we do. So, it threatened to break up the ship. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. Again, the very clear notion that people had a variety of beliefs. And so, I've mentioned this, I think, a while back. We want to keep in mind that's the word that is used. Now, if you forget the rest of the word, you will at least, at the very least, see over there, at the very least, you will recognize this. All of the words that we hear about, the biblical words that we hear about, such as like Bethel, okay, or El Shaddai, and all of these El words. El is simply a shortened form of Elohim, and El means God. Here is the thing though. This is the word that is used here and hundreds, thousands of other places in the Old Testament to mean God. And what's the challenge here? The challenge here is this. It is oops. It is plural. It is plural. Now that's a whole different set of conversations we can have. But the word that is used in the singular in English, in fact, is the Hebrew word that is plural. And it's masculine plural. There is a recognition that other gods exist. We see it in Joshua. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. You guys decide who you want to serve. Okay? There's choice here. Believe it or not, despite what we hear in society, there is choice. Choose this day. Now, the choice comes with a few kind of barricades. You know, you don't get to go and be wild. But choose. So the mariners were afraid and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship to lighten it for them. Okay? If maybe we can toss overboard all of the stuff here, maybe, just maybe, this would save us. Jonah, who, by the way, to reduce this to sort of a straightforward kind of dichotomy, right? Jonah is us. Whether we want to own him or not, too bad. Okay? He is us. And what I mean by that is that Jonah is an insider here. Jonah is the insider. So Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship, and he was laying down, and he was just sleeping as soundly as ever. Meanwhile, the ship is about to break up. They're tossing cargo off. The mariners are praying to their gods. And what is our friend Jonah doing? Resting like a baby in the hold of the ship. The captain came to him and said, "What are you doing, sound asleep? Get up. Call on your God." By the way, here's the thing. I don't really care whose God is going to help us here. If your God could do something, please. Okay? Evidently, our God is now working out so well. So please call in your God. Perhaps the God would spare us a thought so we do not perish. The sailors, same word, the mariners, said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account this calamity." Again, we're not looking for signs here, okay? And whose account this calamity has come upon us. So they cast lots, and not surprisingly, the lot fell on Jonah. We saw this coming, right? Then they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? Where is your country? What's going on here? We now know that somehow you are responsible. Where are you from? What do you do? Who are your people? Who do you pray to? Get up, call in your, and by the way, we don't want to lose track of this. Then Jonah has a just profound and straightforward and honest confession. He said, "I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Now, let me pause here for a second. Jonah says to the mariners, I worship, without using the word again, a creator God. I worship the Lord of the universe, of the sea and the dry land. And by the way, this is before we get Poseidon and company, you know, the gods of, right? So Jonah knows. And here is what I want again to connect us to what we said just, and I'll go back here. Let's see if I can. I'll go back to this for a second. Simply because you repeat and say something that is true, right? That does not get you off the hook. Jonah's confession is profound, it's straight, it's honest. And what are you doing about it, Jonah? As it turns out, not very much, right? I am willing to put at risk the lives of these people, even though I know full well about the nature of the God in whom I believe. Repeating the right words, and this is what Jeremiah was saying. Simply saying, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. I'm in the temple of the Lord, and I come to Bethel, and I worship twice a week, and I give tithe twice a week, and all is well with me. No. All cannot be well simply by repeating the right words where your right words do not translate into right actions. That's the difference. So Jonah gives the confession. Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, what is it that you have done? They realized that Jonah's God is the one who has had the power and clearly has brought this on. What have you have done? What is it that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he told them so. Then they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down? For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. He said to them, and again, look at this. These are the outsiders. These are the sailors. We don't know where they're from. We're never told, right? But clearly they're not Hebrews. And this, he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea, then the sea would quiet down for you. I know it is because of me that this great storm has come. If you take me, by the way, Jonah, it seems at this point, I mean, think about it. Pause for a second. Jonah is running from the presence of the Lord. And Jonah is willing to die before the Ninevites could be saved. And later on he would say, Jonah is willing to die. Throw me overboard. That way you can save yourselves. And while it doesn't say this in the text, you know Jonah being thrown overboard into a tempestuous sea, he's going to die. Let's pause. What do you think the sailors should do? Grab him by his collar and toss him overboard? Nothing else is working. Yeah, and since you agreed to this, our best wishes to you. You know, if you believe in the next life, maybe we'll see you again.
If he demonstrates such confidence, why is he fleeing? I'm trying to put two and two together.
Because he believes, right, that the God in whom he believes is his God. And remember the text begins by saying, I have heard of the wickedness in this place. You know, go, right? Go. Bring some kind of message to them. And his point is, no.
He knows what's going to.
He knows what's going. Okay. Yeah, and when the story ends, it's not like I'm giving away trade secrets. When the story ends, he essentially says to God, I know you were going to do this. That's why I didn't want to do it in the first place. You know, essentially, you and all of your grace for all of this, you know. I mean, you're going to give away grace to everyone? What's the value? I mean, this is his attitude. He wants to place blinders on the grace of God. Blinders on the grace of God, so that it is just narrowly focused on us, because we are the deserving ones. Implications for us?
But why doesn't he jump in? Yeah,
Between you and me,
yeah.
I think he should have, maybe.
I mean, this tells us something about him.
Tells us a great deal about Jonah. He's saying to the people, by the way, then the story would have ended there. That sometimes we're watching movies or watching a movie, and I would say something like, why in the world would they do something like that? Why wouldn't they do something like that? And then I would quickly catch myself, and then I would say to her, she will agree, it's true, because I would say, well, that's probably why I'm not a filmmaker. And that's probably why this movie would have ended in half an hour, because I wouldn't have continued. Right? The story would have ended right here. But we don't want that. Instead, what happens? Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy. Okay? Think about it. Between Jonah on the one hand and the mariners on the other, who at this moment stood up for what you and I might characterize as something that is virtuous and noble? It's the mariners. They did not throw Jonah overboard. They could have. Like you said, maybe if he had courage, right? But he doesn't. But they wouldn't throw him overboard. Then we have this, again, it doesn't use this language, but it's true. Okay, let's pause. Sometimes we don't need to use certain words to capture a moment of transformation and change. Let me explain. I'll take you back to Ruth for a second, which we talked about a couple months ago. Remember what Ruth did with Naomi when they decided? And we have that beautiful passage that is used now as a basis for the Song of Ruth. That begins, remember? Entreat me not to leave you, for where thou goest, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God, and may the Lord. Remember that? It's a remarkable thing. But there is no mention of conversion. There is no mention of transformation. None. That language is not used. But what is it? It's exactly that, isn't it? Ruth, in that moment, has given up everything and given herself over to Naomi's God. Okay? Listen to this now. Then they cried out to the Lord. All of a sudden, right? The God in whom they believed is evidently not in charge here. They cried out to the Lord, please, O Lord, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us feel guilty of... These are the mariners who are afraid that they don't want blood on their hands. Even though the guy that they're trying to save is the one what? About to cause them to die. And they're saying, please do not let us have blood on our hands. Save us. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So then they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from raging. Which I love. Let's pray to the Lord first, right? And then they throw him into the sea. And then, the men feared God even more because what? Right, it stopped. Everything is calm. But the Lord provided a big fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So there is an allusion here, of course, to what? To Jesus, what? Death and resurrection, right? We should not be surprised by 3 days and 3 nights from darkness into light. Okay. Now, even though I don't do this, I have to admit, I've been known to do this, where I'm thinking, really? 3 days in the belly of a big fish with all of that acidic stuff? How is he gonna? And then I have to catch myself. Stop, Hemchan. You are not writing this story. Okay? You don't get to edit part of the story. You could interpret the story, which we all do. But the point is, he is in darkness. He is in death for 3 days. And then a remarkable thing happens. And most scholars, again, we don't know how this is put together. But chapter 2 of Jonah is, and it's actually a remarkable confessional psalm, is what it is. And it's a psalm, is what it is. And it tells us everything about Jonah's belief. So let me read this to you. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. Again, don't get all worked up. How does this work? We have no idea. Okay? But he prayed to God because there is an awareness here now. But he's still in the belly of the big fish. I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol. Sheol is, of course, again, more accurately, the place of the dead. Okay? It's more accurately the place of the dead. Now, hell, of course, is very much a part of the Bible, but Sheol is not like the Greek Hades or anything. This, remember Lazarus and, the place of the dead and calling out to Father, Abraham and all that kind of stuff. It's the place of the dead. We don't want to get carried away and say this is like a holding cell, but it's not Hades or hell as such specifically. But I called out from the belly of Sheol, I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me, and the deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountain I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. And you brought me up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed out Jonah upon the dry land. Don't we just love euphemisms? Spew. He threw him up. Okay? I think there was a place in the Colosseum where, these gladiators fought, Greco world. That was called the vomitorium. Right? We didn't have that here, but the fish threw him up. Okay? And it sung, this is what happens in everyday life in our neighborhood. No, right? But it's interesting, right? In the belly of the fish, Jonah awakens to his beliefs. Now, if the story ended there, what would you think of Jonah? I mean, that's not fair because we know the story doesn't end there. But if it did, what would you think of Jonah?
The heroic survivor.
Heroic survivor, right? In the depth of despair, he found Jesus. Well, except that's in the Old Testament.
Didn't he have him before?
Hmm?
Didn't he have?
Oh, sure, he had that great confession, right? I'm a Hebrew. I believe in the Lord. That obviously was not really helpful to the mariners. But it's funny when you're in the depth of despair, in the darkness of the belly of the big fish. You know, maybe that's when you begin to see, ironically, more clearly.
Oh, I mean, great rest, right? I mean, only now?
Right?
Right. Not really.
How many of us in here believe that Jonah was genuine in his confession here?
He was having his arm twisted in a really serious way.
Let me tell you, if you find yourself, you won't. But if you find yourself in the belly of a big fish for 3 nights, okay, I think you might have some clarity about life. I think if you're in the belly of a big fish for 1 night, you might have some clarity about life. Jonah, it's a great psalm, isn't it? And if it ended here, you will say, well, at least he came to grips with his relationship with God and how God delivers. That, in fact, as I believe, I hope you do as well, that there is a place in our lives for redemption. And we want to be careful not to cast people away too quickly. Jonah makes it a little bit more of a challenge, but it doesn't end there now, does it? Do we have some time? Yeah, a few minutes. So let me, this, by the way, this is not a cliffhanger. It's not like you don't know what's going to happen here. Okay? So it's not like I'm hiding this from you. But to use that language, here's what happens. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Okay? Because we just came off this great confession, right? You're now out of the belly of the big fish. Evidently, you didn't get shredded, right? We don't know where you are, but we now know what you have said that you believe. And what is interesting here is that God said, okay, let's try this again. And so the word came to Jonah a second time, get up, or what sometimes we often see in the Old Testament, occasionally in the New, the language arise, right? Which sounds so much nicer. But you know, with Jonah and you with all of the grime here, get up. Go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you. Okay? By the way, the call is the same call. This is the second time. Are you going to take this seriously or not? Given what you just said about what you believe, I want you to go to Nineveh. And by the way, for us in this room, I want for us to focus. Nineveh is described as what kind of a city? As what? What's the word? A wicked city that is what? That is great. Okay? Now, great is not defined here as having qualities that make us a shining, star on the hill kind of great. This is great as in what? Huge city, right? This is a big city, a large city. So now Nineveh, in case we weren't sure what great meant, is described here as an exceedingly large city, a 3 days walk across. And Jonah began to go into the city. I mean, I'm saying to you now, every word matters here. It was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days walk across. And Jonah began. Jonah, I know you missed that, so let me repeat it. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk. And he cried out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. I have to tell you, I've heard a lot of sermons in my life. And this one is right up there as one of the worst. Okay? I am sending you to Nineveh, which is an exceedingly large city, to let the people know, right? And to preach to them. And Jonah began into the city, right? As if somehow, if I go into the heart of the city or across the city, right, I will be tainted by association. And what's his message? You got 40 days, and if you don't straighten out, right, you're destroyed. Have a good life. That's his message. There is no grace there. None. But then a strange thing happens, and we'll finish on this note. And the people of Nineveh believed God, and they proclaimed the fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. Despite, here, let me put it this way. The people of Nineveh believed and changed in a way not because of Jonah's sermon, but despite. Despite his short, you got 40 days. And if you don't clean up your act in 40 days, you're doomed. By the way, you notice? Here are 10 ways in which you can do that. Here are 5 ways in which you can do that. Let me give you some suggestions. I'm coming from the Lord of all of creation. This is what I believe, and this might help you. No. You're going to die. 40 days. Clean up your act. And then you leave. And the people believed. The people believed. I'll leave it with you. I think in law, there is a phrase that is sometimes used. We don't hear it a lot, but it's sometimes used. It's called a poisonous tree. Have you, right? The poisonous tree. And sometimes you hear it in legal circles in a case where it says, because of the statement that you have made, or the word that you have used, or the act that you have done, is like a tree. And because of that, if it's dishonest, or if it's a lie, right, or if it's wrong, what happens? All of the branches of that tree will be tainted and will die. Okay? It's often used in law. For Jonah here, it's the reverse, right? The spoken word, the British have a saying, the spoken word, right, is like a sped arrow. Once it gets in there, right? Or think of the metaphor of the spoken word. We often think of it as a pebble with ripple effects, right? When you speak that word, no, for good or for ill, it'll spread. But when it's a good word, think of the same metaphor. The water also surrounds and captures that pebble, that rock, right? Where it gets deep into us. Jonah's word, despite what he intended, right, took hold of the people. And they believed the word, not because it was glorious from Jonah, but despite Jonah, they believed. Okay? That is how chapter 3 begins. And you already know this story goes into chapter 4. Okay? So we know it doesn't end there. But for us, we'll stop there. All right? We'll see what happens with Jonah next time. Ma'am.